A day in the life of a candle maker. Before we drift into tonight's story, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss a gentle journey through history. Preparing the wax and materials. The candle maker's day began before most shutters had even been unlatched. Outside, the narrow street still lay in a hushed half-darkness, the stones slick with a thin film of dew that glimmered faintly where the first threads of morning light brushed against them. The scent of cooling night air was sharp and clean, and for a moment, standing at the threshold of the workshop, the candle maker allowed the quiet to settle around him like a well-worn cloak. Inside, the air told a different story, even after. A full night with the fire banked low, there lingered a faint, resinous warmth, a mingling of beeswax, faint smoke, and the dry wood of the shelves and benches. Every surface bore signs of years of labor, hardened wax droplets at the edges of tables, thin scratches in the grain of the wood where knives had once shaved away imperfections, the muted sheen of tools that had been handled countless times. The first task was always the same, and it was one of those duties that rewarded patience. Wax, whether beeswax from the apiaries on the outskirts of town or tallow, rendered from carefully cleaned fats, needed attention before it could be shaped into something as uniform and dependable as a candle. In the half-light he moved to the broad wooden table by the wall, where yesterday's deliveries were stacked in neat blocks, wrapped in linen. Beeswax came in shades that told their own quiet stories, pale gold from early spring flowers, deep amber from the late summer fields. The candle maker handled each block as if it were a rare commodity, because in truth it was. He tested the surface with a thumb, noting whether it felt brittle or pliant, whether it carried the faint scent of the comb from which it came. Each piece was unwrapped, scraped lightly with the edge of a knife to remove any flecks of dust or stray bits of hive debris, and stacked into piles, one for the day's dipping work, another for mold casting. Tallow, by contrast, came in dense, pale slabs, its smell heavier and earthier. It had already been rendered and strained, but he knew from experience that it benefited from a second, slower purification. It would be melted and cooled again before any wick touched it, ensuring the finished candle burned cleaner and longer. The candle maker kept these separate from the beeswax, not only because they were used for different purposes, but because their scents could mingle too easily if stored together. The tools, too, demanded a morning inspection. Brass molds were lifted from their shelf, checked for tiny warps or scratches that could mar the shape of the candle. Dipping rods were laid out in an orderly row, their hooks polished smooth, too. Keep the wicks from snagging. The wick fibers themselves, spun from flax or hemp, rested in a large earthenware jar near the back of the room. He drew out a bundle, running them through his fingers to feel for knots or uneven thickness. Each strand would determine how evenly a candle burned. There was no rushing this selection. By the time the materials were prepared, a soft gray light had begun to spill in through the high, narrow windows, catching the faint sheen of the wax, and turning it momentarily into something that looked almost molten. The workshop was ready, and with the wax sorted, the tools in place, and the wicks at hand, the day could begin in earnest. Setting up the workbench and tools. The candle maker's workbench was more than just a table. It was the heart of the craft, a space where every gesture, every placement of a tool, every measured movement was part of a long, deliberate rhythm. It had been with him for years, its broad planks burnished to a deep patina from countless hours of use. The faint scent of wax had seeped into the wood itself, and in the quiet of the early morning it almost seemed to radiate a muted warmth. Before anything else, the surface had to be cleared. Even though the workshop was tidied at the end of each day, tiny flecks of wax, a stray thread from a wick, or a bit of dust carried in on a boot sole could find their way onto the table overnight. The candle maker took a wide bristled brush and swept the boards from edge to edge, working methodically until nothing remained but the smooth grain of the wood. The floor below the bench, too, was swept clean, not out of vanity, but because a stray bit of grit could easily mar a mold or become embedded in a candle's surface. Next came the arrangement of tools. The dipping rods were placed at the far left, their metal hooks polished and glinting faintly in the slanting morning light. Beside them a row of narrow-bladed knives, each honed to a different edge, lay in descending order of size. Some were for trimming cooled candles, others for scraping away imperfections before the wax hardened fully. A small, shallow box held bundles of wicks cut to the exact length for that day's work, each tied neatly with a loop of twine to keep them from tangling. Near the center of the bench stood a pair of brass molds, heavier than they looked, their polished interiors ready to shape the day's poured candles. He ran a cloth through each one, ensuring there was not the faintest trace of dust or residue from the last batch. Any imperfection inside a mold would be echoed on the surface of the candle, and for a craft that relied so much on uniformity, even the smallest flaw mattered. To the right sat the scale, its twin brass pans dangling from delicate chains. Wax was weighed not only for efficiency, but to ensure consistency in burn time and size. A ledger rested open beside it, its pages covered in neat columns of numbers and brief notes in a steady hand. Each candle type had its own line, with figures for wax weight, wick length, and burn time. The records went back years, a quiet archive of trial, error, and refinement. The hearth was next. A small, brick-lined opening at the far end of the bench held the iron pot where wax would be melted. The candle maker crouched before it, stacking thin kindling at the base, then heavier pieces of seasoned wood above. A flint struck against steel sent sparks tumbling into the tinder, and soon a thin curl of smoke began to rise. The wood caught slowly, and the familiar, muted roar of a waking fire filled the workshop's stillness. You set the iron pot over, the flames empty for now, letting it warm evenly before the wax was added. A second, smaller pot set nearby, used for filtering or coloring smaller batches. Between them, a long-handled ladle rested against the bench, one of the few tools that bore more wear than care, its handle darkened from years of heat, and its bowl faintly stained with layers of wax. Once everything was laid out, knives, rods, molds, scale, pots, and wicks, the workbench seemed less like a simple table and more like a map of the day ahead. Every placement had a purpose. A misplaced knife could slow the rhythm of dipping. An out-of-reach wick could interrupt the steady flow of shaping. By the time the fire in the hearth had settled into a steady, glowing bed of embers, and the pot above began to radiate heat, the candle maker stepped back from the bench and gave the room a long, quiet glance. The workshop was ready, not just in appearance, But in the subtle way, everything seemed to hum in readiness, waiting for the first pour of molten wax, lighting the hearth for melting. The hearth was not just a source of heat. It was the quiet engine of the candle maker's work. Without it, wax would remain stubborn and unyielding, a solid mass incapable of taking on the smooth, flowing shapes that defined his craft. Lighting it was as much a ritual as a task, something to be done with deliberate care. He crouched before the brick-lined opening at the far end of the workshop, where faint traces of yesterday's embers still clung to the hearth's floor like a memory of heat. A thin layer of ash lay scattered over the firebox, soft and pale, and he swept it aside with the edge of a flat iron shovel, revealing the darker stone beneath. From a narrow wooden bin, he selected the first kindling, splinters of dry wood shaved thin enough to catch flame quickly. These he laid in a small crisscross pattern, leaving just enough space for air to move between them. Over this he arranged slightly thicker sticks, their ends cut clean to fit neatly within the hearth's mouth. He knew exactly how much was needed, enough to bring the wax to the correct temperature without making the air stifling in the small room. A bundle of dried plant stalks, gathered months before and hung high from the rafters to keep them dry, was placed at the center. These would take a spark instantly, releasing a brief, sharp scent as they burned away. From the shelf above the hearth he took down his flint and steel. A practiced flick sent a small shower of sparks into the tinder. One caught, glowing faintly, then flared into a thin, wavering flame. The fire grew steadily, its warmth beginning to push back the lingering chill of the morning. Shadows shifted along the workshop walls, flickering in time with the fire's rhythm. The candle maker adjusted the wood now and again, feeding it just enough to keep it bright but steady. When the base of the fire glowed with a rich orange bed of coals, he reached for the iron-melting pot, a deep, round vessel with a long handle, its surface darkened by years of heat. He set it securely over the fire's edge, where it would catch the warmth without sitting directly in the flames. Beeswax blocks, already cleaned and sorted earlier, were placed into the pot one by one. They landed with a muted, solid sound, their surfaces softening almost immediately under the growing heat. A faint fragrance began to rise, warm, sweet, and unmistakable, filling the air with the first true sign that the day's work was underway. He stirred gently with a long-handled wooden paddle, ensuring the heat reached every corner of the pot. The wax began to collapse into itself, thick and viscous at first, then gradually smoothing into a golden liquid. Beside the hearth, a smaller copper pot waited, ready for special batches that might require color or a more precise blend. For now, though, all focus remained on the main pot, watching for the moment when the wax reached that perfect point between too thick and too thin, a state known not by exact measurement, but by the way it moved against the stirring paddle. When it was ready, the surface shimmered like sunlight on still water, and the candle maker knew without hesitation that the workshop was now truly alive. The wax was molten, the tools were in place, and the rhythm of the day could begin. If you're enjoying this quiet stroll through history, don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful stories like this. Sorting beeswax. The morning light had strengthened by the time the candlemaker turned his full attention to the day's wax supply. Though the hearth's warmth filled the workshop, and the scent of melting beeswax already hung in the air, the bulk of the raw material still rested in its linen-enwrapped bundles on the side table. He laid them out in rows across the table, grouping them not only by shade, but by texture. With the flat of his palm, he pressed lightly on each piece, feeling for hardness or slight pliancy. The more supple wax was set aside for molding work, where fine details required a material that would take a sharp impression without cracking. The firmer wax was better suited for dipping, its stiffness allowing candles to hold their shape through repeated layers. Even the scent played a role, in his judgment. Lifting a piece close, he inhaled. Some carried a faint sweetness, others a mellow, resinous tone. This wasn't simply an indulgence. Certain customers swore by the fragrance of early season wax for their homes, claiming it carried a freshness no other candle matched. The candle maker had long since learned to listen to such preferences, for reputation in the craft depended as much on attentiveness as skill. The edges of each block were shaved with a sharp knife to remove any bits of debris, tiny flecks of comb, stray pollen grains, or the occasional speck of dust that had settled during transport. These shavings were collected into a small clay bowl. They would be melted separately, filtered, and used for smaller items such as sealing wax. Nothing was wasted. By the time the sorting was done, the table looked more like a display than a workspace. Neat stacks of gold, cream, and amber wax, each ready for its specific task. The sight carried a certain quiet satisfaction. This was the foundation of every candle that would leave the workshop today, filtering impurities. Even the most carefully gathered and sorted beeswax carried with it traces of its journey, the fine dust of the road from the apiary, the tiny remnants of comb and pollen, and the occasional imperfection left from storage. Filtering was the step that transformed it from a raw, rustic material into something worthy of the candle maker's bench. The iron pot over the hearth now held a pool of molten gold. The surface shifted and gleamed in the firelight, releasing its warm, sweet fragrance into the workshop. He approached slowly, paddle in hand, stirring in long, steady circles to keep the heat even. Beeswax, though resilient, had its temperament. Too much heat and it could scorch, marring both its scent and its color. The candle maker's years of experience meant he could tell by sight and smell when it was at its peak, fluid and smooth, yet not so hot that a thin wisp of smoke would appear. At the far end of the workbench he prepared the filter. A deep, wide-mouthed copper basin was lined with tightly woven cloth, stretched and fastened with twine around the rim. The cloth had been washed and dried the night before, its fibers slightly rough to the touch, perfect for catching the tiniest flecks without absorbing too much of the wax. Beneath it, a second container waited to catch the clarified liquid. As it passed through, lifting the pot required a steady arm and a deliberate motion. He brought it carefully to the bench, the wax swaying gently within, and tipped it toward the filter in a slow, measured pour. The first stream slid through almost silently, its surface catching the light like polished amber. Then came the faint, muted sound of debris settling in the cloth, a soft hiss and scrape as tiny particles met the woven barrier. He paused now and then, allowing the wax to move through naturally rather than forcing it, for haste could push impurities through the weave. Each pour was followed by a moment of stillness, the candlemaker's eyes fixed on the thread-like streams below, watching them gather into the waiting basin. When the last of the molten wax had passed, he gathered the corners of the cloth and lifted it gently, twisting it to press out the remaining liquid. What stayed behind was a compact mass of pale residue, the spent remnants of comb and dust, soon to be discarded. The basin below, in contrast, now held wax of a pure, luminous gold, smooth and clear as honey in sunlight. This clarified wax was returned to a clean pot and set back over the gentle heat of the hearth. It would remain there, kept at a perfect temperature until it was time to dip the first wicks. The candle maker wiped his hands on his apron, feeling that familiar satisfaction. The wax was now free of every trace of its past, ready to take on a new form. Storing in proper conditions, the filtered wax, now clean and shimmering in the hearth's light, was too precious to leave exposed for long. Even in its molten state, the candle maker knew it needed careful handling. Beeswax had a memory of sorts, not in the poetic sense, but in the way it responded to its environment. Too much draft, too rapid a change in temperature, and it could lose the smooth consistency that made for even dipping. A large, lidded copper pot stood ready on a shelf above the hearth. Its interior had been polished to a soft gleam, free from the faintest trace of soot or old residue. This was not simply a vessel for storage. It was a quiet guardian against moisture, dust, and the subtle temperature shifts of the workshop. Using a deep ladle, he transferred the molten wax from the melting pot into this container, each scoop sending a faint ripple across the golden surface. Once filled, the pot was set on a low stand near, but not too close to, the hearth. Close enough to keep the wax supple, far enough to prevent it from overheating. The lid was lowered gently into place, sealing in the warmth. The candle maker checked the fit, ensuring no stray fleck of ash could find its way inside. Beside it, on a different shelf, rested the solid blocks of wax sorted earlier. They, too, had their place in the storage order. The pale spring wax was wrapped in linen and stacked toward the front, ready for the decorative work that would be done later. The deeper amber wax, suited for long-burning dipped candles, was placed toward the back where the air was slightly cooler. This arrangement was no accident. It was the product of years of habit, designed so that the wax most likely to be used soonest was always at hand, and the rest could age quietly without disturbance. Even the air of the storage corner was considered. The small, high window nearby was kept just slightly ajar during much of the year, allowing for a slow movement of fresh air. Stagnant air could make wax dull in scent over time, while a soft circulation helped preserve its natural fragrance. When all was in place, the molten wax sealed in its copper pot, the solid blocks wrapped and stacked neatly, the candle maker stepped back. This corner of the workshop was now as ready as the bench and hearth. The wax was safe, ordered, and waiting for the hands that would shape it into light. He allowed himself a brief pause, leaning against the workbench and listening to the muted sounds of the street beyond the door. The day outside was waking, but within these walls, the preparations had already laid the quiet foundation for every candle that would leave the workshop before nightfall. Choosing fibers. Before a single dip into molten wax could be made, before the shaping, cooling, or trimming, there had to be a wick, the unseen core that gave the candle its purpose. Without it, the candle was nothing more than molded wax. A good wick burned with a steady, clean flame, drawing molten wax upward in a quiet, controlled rhythm. A poor wick, even inside the finest wax, could sputter, smoke, or fail altogether. The candle maker knew this truth as surely as he knew the scent of beeswax and heat. In a large earthen jar at the corner of the bench lay the fibers for the day's work. They had been spun into slender strands months before, coiled neatly, and stored in a dry, airy space above the workshop. Most were flax, chosen for their smooth, even texture and the way they held their form when soaked in wax. Some were hemp, a touch coarser, but favored by certain customers who preferred a slower, more deliberate burn. He untied a bundle and ran his fingers along the length of a strand. The feel told him as much as the look. A slight give, a smoothness without fuzz, no sudden thinning. Each fiber had to be uniform from end to end, for a wick that narrowed unexpectedly would burn unevenly, leaning toward the thicker side and wasting wax. From the bundle, he selected lengths that matched the day's planned work. Shorter wicks were set aside for molded candles, where the wax was poured around them and cooling was quicker. Longer wicks were for dipping. They needed to hang freely without touching the pot's edge, allowing layer after layer of wax to settle evenly along their length. Each chosen strand was coiled loosely on the bench, ready for the next stage. The rejects, those with a stray knot, a hidden fray, or a slight twist, were not discarded outright. They would be used for testing dyes or for small personal candles that lit the workshop in the dark hours of winter mornings. Nothing was wasted here. Even a less than perfect wick had its place, twisting and strengthening. A single strand of fiber, no matter how well spun, was rarely enough on its own. It needed body, a certain firmness to draw molten wax upward in a steady line. This was why twisting and strengthening the wick was a task done with precision, not haste. The candle maker sat at the bench with the chosen lengths laid out before him. From the same jar, he drew matching strands, pairing them carefully so that each set was uniform in thickness and texture. The simplest wicks were made from 2 strands twisted together. More robust ones, meant for thicker candles or longer burn times, used 3. He held the ends between finger and thumb, twisting slowly, feeling the fibers bind to one another. The motion was small but deliberate, turning until the strands lay in a tight, even spiral. There was no snapping tension, only a steady pressure that encouraged the fibers to cling without fraying. The sound was almost inaudible, a faint rasp of flax against flax, the whisper of the twist growing denser. Once a section was twisted, he ran it lightly over the edge of the bench, pressing it down to fix its shape. This also smoothed any stray fibers, ensuring that when the wick was dipped into molten wax, the coating would settle evenly along its surface without catching on. Loose threads. Some wicks, especially those intended for long burning tapers, received an extra strengthening step, a brief soaking in a thin solution of plant-based starch. This bath gave the fibers a faint stiffness, helping them keep their straightness during dipping. After soaking, the wicks were hung from a wooden rod to dry, the faint scent of the starch mingling with the beeswax already warming on the hearth. The drying process itself was part of the rhythm. While the wicks dried, the candle maker would tend the fire, check the molten wax, and prepare molds for the day's poured candles. By the time he returned to the bench, the wicks would be ready, firm, straight, and quietly waiting for their first coating of wax. He set the finished bundles aside, neatly looped and tied with thin cord, each coil the same length as the next. The workshop had a certain visual order now, the molten gold of the beeswax glowing gently over the hearth, the tools laid out in their precise places, and the wicks in orderly rows, their pale spirals catching the light from the high windows. Let's pause for just a moment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to join us for more calm stories. Wax priming the wick. A wick left bare would burn too quickly, its fibers flaring rather than feeding the flame in a steady draw. Priming, the act of coating it in a thin, even layer of wax before candle making, was what transformed a simple length of fiber into the reliable heart of a candle. The candle maker brought the neatly coiled bundles to the hearth, where the clarified beeswax shimmered in the pot like liquid amber. The fire beneath was low now, the coals glowing steadily, ensuring the wax stayed warm enough to flow, but never so hot as to scorch the fibers. One by one, he lifted the wicks by their tied ends, letting them dangle freely. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he lowered them into the molten wax. The surface parted silently, swallowing the pale strands until they disappeared completely. Beneath the gold, a faint series of bubbles rose, the last of the air escaping from between the fibers, and then the liquid stilled again. He let them rest in the warmth just long enough for every thread to take on the wax, then drew them upward in a slow, unbroken pull. The excess dripped back into the pot, trailing down in fine threads before vanishing into the molten surface. The wicks emerged changed, no longer the pale, loose twist of bare fiber, but firm, smooth cords glistening faintly in the firelight. Each primed wick was hung on a wooden rod stretched across two stands. Here they cooled in the open air, straightening under their own weight. The beeswax coating, still soft, held the twist perfectly in place as it set. He moved down the row, dipping and hanging, until the rod was filled with neat, golden lines. The cooling process was quick, but he gave them time. Nonetheless, while they rested, he returned to the bench, tidying his tools and brushing stray flecks of wax from the surface. The primed wicks, once cooled, would be cut to the exact lengths needed for the day's work, some left long for dipping in pairs, others trimmed shorter for molds. By the time the last bundle was ready, the workshop felt prepared in every way. The wax was molten and clean, the molds polished, the workbench arranged, and now the wicks, the true core of the craft, stood ready for their transformation. The candle maker looked at them with a quiet satisfaction. Each one was a promise, a small, silent thread that would carry light into someone's home. And with that thought, he knew the morning's preparations were complete, and the work of shaping candles could begin. Preparing the wax vat, the heart of the candle maker's work stood in the center of the workshop, the dipping vat. It was a tall, narrow vessel of hammered copper, its height allowing candles to grow long and even, its narrow width keeping the wax deep enough for full immersion. He began the morning by checking the wax once more. Yesterday's scrapings, trimmings, and cooled drips from earlier work had been gathered into a linen sack, ready to be melted alongside the fresh beeswax. Nothing was wasted. Each fragment, no matter how small, carried the same golden scent and burn. The fire beneath the vat was built from hardwood, chosen for its slow, even heat. He lit it carefully, arranging the coals so the flame would never leap too high. Beeswax was as sensitive as it was precious. Too much heat could darken its color, spoil its scent, or make it brittle once cooled. Slowly the wax began to yield. First, the smallest edges softened, losing their sharp definition. Then a sheen appeared across the surface as the warmth spread. Soon the solid forms sank into themselves, folding inward like honey stirred in a pot. The air grew rich with the faint, sweet aroma of warm wax, a scent both calming and practical, a sign that the vat was coming to readiness. He stirred gently with a long-handled wooden paddle, ensuring no unmelted lumps hid at the bottom. The paddle was smooth from years of use, its handle darkened by countless hours of being held over the warmth of the vat. The motion was slow and steady, moving the molten gold in quiet circles. Once the wax reached its perfect clarity, no cloudiness, no fragments, he tested its readiness in the old way. Dipping a fingertip into cool water, he let a single drop of wax fall from the paddle into his palm. It hardened instantly, and when pressed between thumb and finger, it bent without breaking. That was the sign. The wax was hot enough to coat smoothly, yet cool enough to build layers without cracking. Beside the vat, the primed wicks hung from a rack. They were paired and looped over long wooden rods, each wick dangling freely to allow for perfect symmetry during dipping. The candle maker gave them a final glance, checking that none were twisted or uneven. The workshop was quiet now, save for the faint pop of the fire and the soft movement of the molten wax. Everything was in place. The tools, the wicks, the heat, and the first true rhythm of the day was about to begin. Receiving and inspecting raw wax. Upon receiving raw wax, the candle maker inspected it meticulously. Each block bore the marks of its origin, traces of honey, bits of propolis, and occasional impurities from the hive. The surface was sometimes rough or crumbly, a sign that further refinement was necessary before use. The candle maker set aside any blocks that showed excessive dirt or damage for additional cleaning or repurposing in less visible candles. Those of high quality were stacked carefully in a dry, cool part of the workshop where they awaited melting, cleaning, and rendering the wax. Before use, raw wax needed to be purified. Impurities could cause discoloration, affect burn quality, or leave residue in finished candles. The maker employed a methodical rendering process involving heating and filtering. Blocks of wax were cut into smaller chunks, then placed in large copper or iron kettles filled partially with water. The kettles were heated over a gentle fire, melting the wax slowly. Because wax floated atop water, impurities sank or were left behind in the lower layers. Once melted, the liquid wax was carefully poured through fine cloth filters often made from muslin or linen into clean vats to remove debris and suspended particles. This clarified wax was then left to cool in shallow containers, solidifying into smooth, uniform sheets ready for further work. Storing rendered wax. Rendered wax sheets were stored on wooden shelves, stacked with sheets of parchment or clean cloth between them to prevent sticking. The candle maker maintained these stores in a temperature-controlled space, avoiding extremes of heat or cold that could warp or crack the wax. Good storage preserved the wax's qualities for weeks or months, allowing the maker to draw from reserves during busy production periods without loss of quality. Melting and maintaining wax temperature. When ready for candle production, wax was transferred to dipping vats. Here, the maker carefully controlled temperature using small fires, adjusting heat to keep wax molten but stable. Too much heat risked thinning the wax, causing uneven layers when dipping. Too little heat led to wax hardening prematurely, making it difficult to coat wicks evenly. The maker relied on experience, tools like wooden sticks to test viscosity, and constant observation to maintain ideal conditions. Building layers and drying. The first thin coating of wax was only the beginning. A single dip yielded a candle barely thicker than the wick itself, too fragile to stand or burn steadily. The true strength and form came from patient repetition, layer upon layer, each one building slowly and visibly into the final shape. The candle maker watched carefully as the first dips cooled and hardened. He knew how the wax behaved in this quiet phase, firming gently, the surface becoming less glossy and more matte, but still warm to the touch. This was the moment when the candle took its earliest breath, gaining body and weight with every passing minute. Returning to the dipping vat, he picked up the next pair of primed wicks. Lowering them once again into the molten gold, he counted, silently feeling the thickness of the coating grow as the wax clung to the fibers. Each time they emerged, the dripping became slower wax, adhered firmly now, no longer a smooth glaze, but a solid layer. The drying rack with its slender wooden rods was the workshop's silent partner in this process. Here the candles hung suspended, their weight pulling the wax downward, shaping the taper with gravity's gentle hand. The candle maker checked their alignment, gently rotating any that seemed to lean or twist, ensuring each would harden in a perfect straight line. Between dips, he paced slowly around the workshop, tending to the hearth and the tools, sweeping the floor of stray wax flakes and dust. The pace was deliberate, neither rushed nor stalled, a steady rhythm that had been refined through years of practice. With every pass, the candles thickened. The first layer's translucence gave way to a creamy opacity, the color deepening, from pale gold to a richer, warmer hue. The surface texture evolved as well, from glassy smooth to subtly rippled, a fingerprint of the hand and heat that had shaped it. Throughout the process, the candle maker kept a watchful eye on the temperature of the wax. A dip too soon could mar the surface with streaks or bubbles. Too late, and the wax might cool unevenly, causing cracks or brittle edges. The fire was his constant concern, a living thing that demanded attention and respect. After several dips, the candles felt firm and substantial. He ran a careful finger along their length, testing the layer's consistency. When satisfied, he set them aside on a clean cloth to complete their slow cool, the soft light of the workshop wrapping around them like a gentle cloak. Each finished candle was more than a simple tool of light. It was a record of time, care, and skill. The repeated dips, the careful drying, the small adjustments made throughout the process, all these were etched invisibly into the wax, shaping not just the candle, but the experience of light itself. As the day progressed, the workshop filled with rows of candles in every stage of formation, glistening fresh dips, soft drying layers, and the steady, solid shapes of those nearly ready for trimming and finishing. If you're enjoying this quiet stroll through history, don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful stories like this. Preparing the molds. While the dipping vat and steady rhythm of repeated layers shaped the slender tapers of the workshop, another craft ran alongside it, the art of mold work. Poured candles, set firm within their brass or tin molds, required a different kind of attention, less repetitive, but no less exacting. The candle maker began the day's mold work by selecting the molds needed from their shelf. These were heavy, polished vessels of metal brass with a soft gleam, tin with a subtle gray sheen shaped into cylinders, squares, or decorative forms. Each mold was worn smooth from years of use, its interior carrying a faint imprint of past. Candles, the subtle curve of a taper, or the gentle ridges of a carved design. Before use, the molds were thoroughly cleaned. Dust and residue left from previous batches could mar the surface of a candle, leaving dull spots or trapped air bubbles. The candle maker wiped each mold with a soft cloth dipped in warm water, taking care not to soak the metal too long and risk rust or corrosion. After drying them carefully, he rubbed the interiors with a thin layer of beeswax, not for coating this time, but to act as a gentle release agent. The molds were then arranged on the workbench, positioned close to the hearth, but not too near, as sudden temperature changes could cause metal to warp or crack. This careful placement ensured the molds warmed gradually, preventing the hot wax poured inside from cooling unevenly or setting too quickly. Each mold was inspected for damage, a slight dent, a scratch, or a tiny gap where the two halves met. Even the smallest flaw could affect the candle's shape, causing it to stick or crack during removal. When necessary, the candle maker used a small file or brush to smooth edges or reseat clamps that held the mold halves securely. Once the molds were ready, he prepared the wax for pouring. It was a pure batch, filtered meticulously the day before and kept at a precise temperature. Wax that was too cool would begin to set immediately upon contact with the mold, causing uneven surfaces or weak spots. Too hot, and it could blister or discolor. The workshop, with its quiet hum of morning activity, the steady glow of the hearth, the faint scent of warm beeswax, the rows of dipped candles drying nearby, seemed to hold its breath as the candle maker prepared to pour the day's first mold. Pouring and setting wax. The moment had come to transform molten wax into form, to shape light through the simple act of pouring. The candle maker lifted the carefully heated pot from its resting place near the hearth. Its surface shimmered with golden warmth, and the soft glow of the fire reflected gently on its polished rim. With steady hands, he brought the pot to the edge of the workbench, where the molds awaited in quiet rows. He selected the first, a slender brass cylinder, its interior smooth and ready to receive the liquid wax. The halves were carefully aligned and clamped tight, a delicate balance of force ensuring the wax would not leak or create unwanted seams. The pour was slow and deliberate. The wax flowed like liquid gold, filling the mold steadily, the surface rising with a smooth, unbroken motion. The candle maker kept his eyes on the level, watching for signs of bubbles or uneven filling. A trapped bubble here could cause a weak point, an imperfection that would show in the final candle's surface or cause it to crack during cooling. When the mold was full, he set the pot aside and allowed the wax to settle. Cooling began immediately, and the candle maker kept the mold steady, free from vibration or disturbance. Any jarring movement could mar the soft wax or cause it to separate from the mold's walls unevenly. The workshop's temperature was important now. A slow, even cool prevented cracking and ensured the candle retained a smooth surface. The candle maker checked the molds periodically, touching the metal gently to feel for firmness. Within minutes, the wax transitioned from molten liquid to solid form, its color deepening as it hardened. After the wax had set enough to hold its shape firmly, he carefully unclamped the mold halves. There was a soft, almost inaudible sound as the metal parts separated, releasing the candle within. The candle slipped free with a gentle push, its surface cool and matte but unmistakably formed. The candle maker ran his fingers along its length, noting the smooth curves and the fine details carried from the mold. Imperfections were rare, but when found, they were corrected with careful scraping or light sanding once the candle was fully cooled. This process repeated with each mold filling, setting, releasing, until the day's poured candles were all formed and resting on clean cloths to cool completely. Finishing touches and storage. Once the candles had been released from their molds, the work was far from finished. Though their forms were clear and smooth, each candle bore the subtle marks of its birth, small ridges from the mold's seam, slight imperfections needing refinement before the candle could be deemed complete. The candle maker laid the freshly released candles on a soft, woven cloth atop a low table. The cloth cushioned the wax, preventing any dents or scratches during the delicate finishing process. He inspected each one carefully under the soft daylight filtering through the workshop windows. Using a thin, sharp knife, he traced along the length of every candle, gently scraping away raised edges left by the mold's seams. His hands were steady and sure, the blade moving slowly in smooth, deliberate strokes. Where necessary, he used a fine-grained sanding cloth, buffing the surface to an even matte finish without dulling the natural glow of the wax. Some candles, intended as gifts or for special orders, received a final polish with a soft cloth lightly dampened with beeswax. Oil. This subtle touch restored a gentle sheen, enhancing the candle's warm color and releasing a faint, comforting aroma. After finishing, the candles were carefully bundled according to size and type. The larger tapers were tied in pairs with thin linen twine, while smaller molded candles were stacked gently in shallow wooden boxes lined with soft fabric. Each bundle was labeled by hand, the candle maker's neat script noting the wax type, weight, and intended use. Storage was as precise as preparation. The workshop's shelves held these bundles in neat rows, arranged to keep similar candles together and to allow air to circulate freely around them. Proper ventilation prevented moisture from dulling the wax or inviting dust to settle, while stable, moderate temperatures preserved their form and scent. As he returned the tools to their places and swept the floor of stray wax flakes, the candle maker allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The day's work was well begun. The glowing vats, the drying racks full of dipped candles, and the smooth rows of molded forms all testified to skill, patience, and care. Soon, the next phase would begin the trimming, finishing, and packaging that prepared these candles for the journey beyond the workshop walls. But for now, in the soft light of late morning, the candle maker stood surrounded by the quiet promise of light, warmth, and quiet evenings yet to come. Preparing the workspace, The finishing touches were the last step in the candle maker's daily rhythm, the point where form met function, and a candle moved from a simple shape to a tool of light and warmth. Before trimming could begin, the workspace needed to be carefully arranged. A long, sturdy table stood near the workshop window, where soft daylight illuminated every detail. This was the trimming bench, reserved solely for the delicate task of shaping candle wicks and smoothing surfaces. It was kept meticulously clean, free from dust or stray wax flakes that might spoil the candle's finish. Tools were arrayed with precision, slender scissors with sharp, narrow blades for cutting wicks, fine knives for scraping and carving, small brushes for dusting off remnants, and soft claws for polishing. Each tool bore the marks of frequent, use-darkened handles, slightly worn edges, but remained carefully maintained. Nearby, small wooden racks held bundles of candles fresh from the dipping vat and molds, arranged by size and stage of readiness. The candle maker moved between these and the trimming bench with quiet efficiency, selecting each candle in turn. Light was essential here, not just for seeing, but for judging quality. The window's soft glow highlighted every tiny imperfection in wax or wick, every uneven edge or stray fiber. The candle maker's practiced eyes scanned each candle carefully, knowing that even the smallest flaw could affect how the candle burned. Before beginning, he cleaned his hands thoroughly, wiping away any wax or soot. The work required steady fingers, and patience rushing here could lead to mistakes that no amount of polishing could hide. With everything in place, the tools, the light, the candles, the candle maker was ready to begin the final transformation. Let's pause for just a moment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to join us for more calm stories. Trimming the wick, the workshop had settled into a quiet rhythm by midday. The low hum of the hearth's embers, the faint scent of beeswax lingering in the air, and the soft daylight filtering through the tall windows combined to create an atmosphere both focused and calm. It was here, at the trimming bench, that the candle maker performed one of the most delicate steps in his craft, trimming the wick. Though the wax had been shaped, molded, and layered with care, the wick, the slender thread at the candles, core held the secret to how the candle would burn. Too long, and it would smoke, flicker, and waste precious wax in an unruly blaze. Too short, and the flame would struggle to draw enough fuel, sputtering weakly before fading out. The candle maker understood the wick's nature intimately. Years of observation had taught him that the wick was not merely a passive conduit for flame, but a living, breathing part of the candle's life. It required careful balance, a subtle touch, and an eye tuned to its quiet language. Preparing the tools. The trimming bench was a study in order and purpose. Each tool had its place, worn smooth by years of handling, its surface bearing the marks of countless mornings and evenings spent in the same quiet work. On one side lay the trimming scissors, a pair of delicate, sharply pointed blades designed for precision. Their thin tips allowed the candle maker to reach deep into the candle's core, cutting without disturbing the wax surrounding the wick. The handles were wrapped in soft leather strips, worn shiny by the grip of steady hands. Beside the scissors rested a collection of small knives, each blade thin and keen. These were used not for cutting, but for scraping and shaping the wick, and the wax around it smoothing any imperfections or excess wax that could disrupt the flame. The blades gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and the candle maker kept them razor sharp, honing the edges on a leather strop before every day's work. A soft brush completed the set, a small bundle of horsehair bound tightly to a wooden handle. This brush was used to gently sweep away any flakes or dust from the trimming, ensuring the candle's surface remained pristine and free of debris that might affect burning. Selecting the candle. The candle maker selected his first candle from the drying rack. It was a pair of dipped tapers, their surfaces smooth and cool to the touch. Each candle was inspected carefully before trimming began. Holding the candle upright in his hand, the maker examined the wick's length, its color, and its texture. Freshly dipped wicks were often still slightly flexible, coated in a thin layer of beeswax that preserved their shape. As the wax hardened, over time the wick became firmer, but it was this initial stage that demanded the greatest care. The candle maker ran a finger gently along the wick, noting any unevenness or frayed fibers. A wick too thick at the tip could cause the flame to flare and sputter, while one too thin might burn too quickly or unevenly. The art of the cut. The scissors opened smoothly, their blades catching the light. With a steady hand, the candle maker positioned the scissors just above the wax surface, aiming for the wick's ideal length. Traditionally, the wick was trimmed to approximately 1/4 inch above the wax. This length was not arbitrary. It was the result of generations of trial, observation, and experience. At this length, the wick burned cleanly, with a steady flame that melted the wax evenly and prevented excessive smoking. He made the first snip with care, the blade slicing through the fibers with a faint but satisfying crispness. The trimmed wick fell softly onto the cloth beneath, its freshly cut end sharp and even. This first cut was followed by a careful inspection. The candle maker brought the candle close to his eye, tilting it slightly to observe the wick's profile. If the cut was uneven, he made tiny adjustments, snipping stray fibers or shaping the tip to a fine point. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and precise, never rushed, never careless. The candle maker knew that even the smallest imperfection could disrupt the flame's behavior, leading to flickering or soot. Listening to the wick. For the candle maker, trimming was more than a mechanical task. It was a dialogue with the candle itself. Over years of experience, he had learned to listen to the wick, observing subtle clues that revealed its temperament. A wick that felt too soft might require extra trimming or firming. Some wicks spun from coarser fibers, responded differently to heat, and might need to be cut slightly longer to compensate. Others, especially those coated in thicker layers of wax, burned more slowly and steadily with a shorter wick. He occasionally tested a small sample wick by lighting it in a quiet corner of the workshop. Watching the flame, he noted its size, steadiness, and color. A bright, steady flame signaled a well-trimmed wick. A flickering, smoky one indicated further adjustments were needed. This constant observation was critical. The candle maker's reputation depended on the quality of his candles, each one burning cleanly, without smoke or drip, filling homes with warm, steady light. The final sweep. Once satisfied with the wick's length and shape, the candle maker used the soft horsehair brush to gently clear away any tiny clippings or wax flakes. The brush moved in slow, careful strokes, sweeping from base to tip, ensuring no stray debris could interfere with the candle's burning. This final sweep also helped smooth the wax surface around the wick, removing minute imperfections that might catch flame or cause uneven melting. The light bristles left behind a soft, matte finish that caught the afternoon light beautifully. The sensory world of trimming. The trimming process was sensory in every sense. The cool touch of smooth wax, the settled scent of warmed beeswax, mingled with the faint leather aroma of the scissors handle, the soft scratch of blade against fiber, and the gentle brush against polished surfaces. The workshop was alive with quiet sounds, the faint snap of scissors, the whisper of brushing, the occasional soft crackle from the hearth. These sounds mingled with the warm glow of sunlight, the scent of wax and wood, and the cool draft from an open window. Each candle trimmed was a moment suspended in time, an act of care, patience, and precision that shaped not just a tool of light, but a quiet comfort for the evenings to come. Repetition and rhythm. The candle maker continued through the rows of candles, repeating the process over and over. Each wick trimmed was slightly different, each candle unique in its subtle curves and color variations. The repetition was meditative, a slow rhythm that filled the workshop with quiet purpose. Sometimes he paused to step back and look over his work. The trimmed candles lined up like quiet soldiers, their wicks neat and uniform, their wax surfaces clean and smooth. Though each candle was a simple object, the care poured into every step, from wax preparation to wick trimming, was evident. These candles would burn steadily, safely, and beautifully, carrying the workshop's skill into homes beyond its walls. Reflection on the craft. Trimming the wick was more than a necessary step. It was a moment of connection between maker and material. In this simple act, the candle maker touched the flame before it existed, shaping how it would dance, how it would warm, and how it would light the dark. This step required patience and attention to detail, the very qualities that defined his craft. It was a quiet, unhurried conversation with centuries of tradition, a bridge between raw nature and human need. As the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the bench, the candle maker felt the familiar satisfaction of a task well done. The trimmed wicks stood ready, each one the heart of a candle waiting to fulfill its purpose, to bring light and warmth, to hold a steady flame in a quiet room. The ritual of inspection. The candle maker approached the long wooden table with slow, deliberate steps, each movement embodying the reverence he held for his craft. Inspection was more than a routine. It was a ritual of respect for the candles that had taken shape through hours of work, attention, and patience. He began by selecting a candle at random, holding it upright against the light streaming through the tall windows. The late sun cast a warm golden hue, allowing the smallest details in the wax's surface to be seen, minute ripples, faint scratches, or tiny air pockets that might have formed unnoticed. His eyes, sharp and practiced, traced every inch of the candle's length. The wax needed to be smooth, with no blemishes that could mar its burn or its appearance. Imperfections might seem minor, but to the candle maker they told stories of temperature fluctuations, uneven cooling, or slight mishandling. Each imperfection was a flaw in the promise the candle made to its future user. With gentle fingertips, he ran his hands along the candle's sides, feeling for rough spots or irregularities hidden beneath the surface. The wax was cool but not brittle, firm yet with a subtle give. It was a balance that spoke of perfect curing, neither too fast nor too slow. The wick's final test. Next came the wick, the small but vital core of the candle's function. The trimmed end was inspected closely to ensure its cut was clean and even. He checked its straightness, ensuring it stood true above the wax without bending or leaning. In some cases, the candle maker would perform a simple flame test. He brought the candle to a small, sheltered alcove in the workshop designed for such trials, lighting the wick with a match carefully struck on a flint stone. The flame leapt to life with a gentle orange glow, steady and unwavering. He observed the flame's behavior, noting its size, steadiness, and color. A well-trimmed wick would produce a clean, bright flame, neither flickering wildly nor producing thick, black smoke. The candle burned for several minutes, the wick melting the wax at an even pace, creating a smooth pool of liquid wax at the candle's top. This test, quiet and simple, was a crucial final step, ensuring that the candle's promise of light would be fulfilled without flaw, repair, and refinement. If any imperfections appeared during inspection or testing, the candle maker set the candle aside for repair. Using fine knives and gentle sanding claws, he would carefully scrape away any roughness or uneven patches in the wax. Sometimes small cracks or surface blemishes could be gently reheated and smoothed by passing the candle near the hearth's warm glow. Never too close, but enough to soften the wax's surface for delicate reshaping. Wick adjustments might also be necessary. A wick that burned unevenly could be recut or, in rare cases, replaced entirely. Though this was labor-intensive, it was essential for ensuring the highest quality in every finished candle. Packaging with care. With each candle approved, the candle maker began the final process, packaging. Though simple in form, packaging was treated with as much respect as the candle itself. Soft sheets of clean, hand-woven linen were cut and laid carefully over the workbench. Each candle was wrapped individually, the linen protecting the wax from scratches and dust during transport. Pairs of taper candles were tied gently with linen cord, knotted in a way that was secure but unobtrusive. Small paper tags written by hand with ink and quill noted the candle's type, weight, and the date of manufacture. These tags were not mere labels, but a certificate of craftsmanship, a message from maker to user. For molded candles or special orders, wooden boxes were prepared. The boxes were simple, crafted from light pine, lined with soft cloth to cushion the candles. Each box was closed carefully and tied with ribbon or cord, ready for delivery or sale. Reflection and quiet hours. As evening deepened and the workshop grew shadowed and cool, the candle maker took a moment to reflect. The day's labor was complete. Beeswax transformed from raw blocks into finished candles, each one a vessel of light and warmth. The gentle glow of the hearth flickered in the quiet room, its flames echoing the promise held within every candle. The tools were cleaned and stowed, the floor swept. The air still scented with the subtle sweetness of wax. Though simple in appearance, the candles embodied hours of careful work, patience, and a deep respect for the craft and its traditions. For the candle maker, this quiet satisfaction was its own kind of light, one that illuminated not only the workshop, but the long, winding path of skill, care, and connection that lay between maker, material, and those who would one day light their homes with the humble candle. Preparing to light, the moment a candle moves from silent stillness into flame is nothing short of a quiet transformation. It is a moment pregnant with anticipation, a ritual both practical and profound. Preparing to light a candle was more than merely striking a match or kindling a spark. It was a deliberate act of intention, of creating a small sanctuary of warmth and illumination in the surrounding space. In a humble workshop or a simple home, the tools for lighting were as important as the candle itself. The candle maker's customers might have used flint and steel, striking sparks onto dry tinder, coaxing flame with patience and care. Others might have used early matches, slender sticks, coated with combustible materials that ignited with a quick friction. Regardless of the tool, each was handled with respect, for the flame it produced was fragile and precious. In preparation, the candle holder was chosen with thought. A sturdy iron or brass stand, often forged by a blacksmith or crafted by a metal worker, ensured the candle remained upright and secure. Some holders had small cups to catch dripping wax, protecting surfaces beneath. Others were simple rings fixed to tall handles designed to carry a candle safely from room to room. The candle itself was examined before lighting. The wick was checked once more, its length confirmed to be just right, neither too long to smoke and flicker, nor too short to falter. The candle's surface, smooth and cool, was free of dust and dirt that could taint the flame or cause unwanted sparks. In some homes, lighting a candle was a quiet ceremony. Windows might be opened slightly to allow fresh air, avoiding smoky rooms. Hearths might be stirred to ensure a steady draft, inviting the new flame to breathe. The candle maker's skill extended beyond crafting wax. He understood this delicate dance between flame and air, light and shadow. With all preparation done, the lighting began. A small, bright spark, the careful bringing together of tinder and flame. The wick caught fire slowly at first, smoldering, then flaring gently into steady light. The candle's transformation was complete. Let's pause for just a moment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to join us for more calm stories. The first flame. The process of igniting a candle was a moment that required patience, precision, and a careful understanding of materials. It began with selecting the proper means to create a flame, whether striking flint and steel to produce sparks or using early forms of matches. Each method demanded skill and attention. In many workshops and homes, flint and steel were the primary tools. The maker struck a piece of hard steel against flint, sending tiny sparks to fall onto a bed of dry tinder, often fine, brittle fibers, such as charred linen or dry moss. These sparks needed to catch quickly, feeding a small ember that could then be coaxed into a steady flame by gently blowing or shielding it from drafts. Once the flame was achieved, the candle maker carefully brought the burning tinder close to the candle's wick. The wick, composed of tightly twisted fibers, often linen, absorbed wax and oil to sustain the flame. It required a delicate balance. If the wick was damp or too short, it would resist catching fire. If too long or charred, it would produce smoke and burn unevenly. As the flame touched the wick, the surrounding wax began to respond. Heat softened the wax surface slowly, creating a thin, glossy layer of molten wax around the base of the flame. This liquid wax was critical. It served as fuel, drawn upward into the wick's fibers by capillary action, feeding the flame and allowing it to maintain steady combustion. The initial moments were delicate. The flame flickered and shifted in response to slight air currents, the wick's condition, and the temperature of the wax. A flame too large or aggressive could burn through wax too quickly, leading to dripping or uneven melting. Conversely, a weak flame might sputter and extinguish before the candle could fully light. Watching the flame stabilize revealed the complex interaction between air, fuel, and heat. The maker adjusted the candle's position slightly, shielding it with a hand or adjusting nearby objects to prevent errant drafts. The steady, blue-tipped flame was the goal, a clear indicator of correct wick length, good wax quality, and proper environmental conditions. The gentle glow from the candle transformed the surrounding space, casting soft light and shadows that shifted with the flame's flicker. In practical terms, this light extended work hours, allowing tasks to continue. After dusk, the flame's heat was modest but noticeable, providing a small source of warmth. The maker paid close attention to the flame's behavior during those first minutes, trimming the wick as needed with fine scissors to ensure it burned cleanly. Smoke indicated that the wick was too long or uneven, and careful clipping restored balance. Over time, this close monitoring was essential to prolong the candle's life and maximize efficiency. Preparing for storage. The day's work had wound down. The warm glow of the hearth softened to a gentle ember, and the last flickers of daylight faded beyond the windows. The candle maker now turned his focus to a less visible, but no less vital stage of his craft: the care and storage of candles. Candles, though simple in shape and form, were delicate artifacts of light, subject to the slow effects of time and environment. Wax could soften or become brittle, wicks could gather dust or moisture, and careless storage could lead to blemishes or damage that would mar a candle's beauty and function. Preparing candles for storage was an art in itself, requiring patience, precision, and a careful hand. The candle maker began by selecting a clean, quiet space within the workshop, away from the heat of the hearth and the damp of outside walls. This storage room was cool, dry, and well ventilated, conditions essential for preserving the integrity of the wax and wick. Each candle was inspected with care before being placed into storage. The surface was examined for any signs of damage, small cracks, chips, or dust. The wick was checked, ensuring it was clean, dry, and trimmed to an appropriate length to prevent any issues when the candle was next lit. Candles were then gently wrapped in soft cloth, often linen or muslin, protecting their surfaces from scratches and dust. This wrapping was not haphazard, but a deliberate act, folded neatly and tied with thin linen cord to secure without pressing too tightly. The candle maker arranged the wrapped candles on wooden shelves, stacked carefully to avoid any undue pressure or contact. Larger candles were stored standing upright, while smaller tapers might lie flat, cushioned, and supported. Throughout this process, the candle maker maintained a slow, measured rhythm, mindful that the quality of storage would affect the candle's future life and light. The quiet care given to these moments was a testament to the respect held for his craft and the simple objects that carried so much warmth and comfort. If you're enjoying this quiet stroll through history, don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful stories like this. Environmental factors and preservation. The art of caring for candles extended far beyond the simple act of wrapping and shelving. The candle maker knew that subtle changes in the environment, the unseen rhythms of temperature, humidity, light, and air could slowly alter the wax's texture and the wick's readiness, quietly diminishing a candle's beauty and function. Wax, while solid and seemingly sturdy, was remarkably sensitive to heat. A candle stored too close to a hearth or in a sunlit window could soften, losing its carefully formed shape. The surface might become tacky, attracting dust and debris that marred the candle's smooth finish. Over time, this softness could lead to misshapen candles, making them difficult to light or causing uneven burns when used. Conversely, extreme cold could cause wax to become brittle and prone to cracking. The candle maker's storage space was carefully chosen to avoid such extremes, maintaining a steady, moderate temperature that preserved the wax's natural texture. Humidity was another invisible force at play. Too much moisture in the air could cause wicks to absorb dampness, making them slow to light or prone to sputtering flames. Moisture could also encourage mold or mildew to form on cloth wrappings or wooden shelves, threatening both candles and their surroundings. To counter these risks, the candle maker ensured that the storage room was well ventilated, allowing air to circulate freely without drafts that might disturb the candles. Small windows or vents were opened in dry weather to refresh the air, but tightly sealed when storms threatened. Light itself was a hidden enemy. Prolonged exposure to sunlight or even strong indoor illumination could cause wax to discolor or the wick fibers to weaken. Shelves were placed away from direct light, and cloth wrappings provided additional protection from any stray rays. The candle maker's vigilance extended to the materials used in storage. Wooden shelves were constructed from seasoned pine, carefully planed and sanded to avoid splinters or rough surfaces that could scratch candles. The cloth used for wrapping was freshly laundered and kept free of dyes or scents that might transfer to the wax. In this quiet room, the candles rested in a balance of protection and breathability, surrounded by the subtle care of a maker who understood their delicate nature. The environment was their guardian, preserving their readiness to become light. In dark times, warmth in cold nights, and quiet comfort in solitary hours.